An old man sat alone at the corner table in the bustling cafe, flipping through the worn pages of a yellowed paperback novel. His gray wool coat was neatly buttoned, his brown leather shoes polished but faded with age. He wore a flat cap that shadowed his weathered face, and round, wire-rimmed glasses perched on the bridge of his nose. Around him, young people scrolled through smartphones, laughed at viral videos, and tapped away furiously. Immersed in a digital world he seemed excluded from. From the table nearby, a voice snorted with derision. "Dude, look at that, Grandpa. Reading a book. In 2025, what's next? Sending telegrams." The laughter that followed was sharp and careless. "Maybe he's waiting for his pigeon to bring him the morning news," another added, and they burst out laughing again. The old man glanced up. His blue eyes, sharp and clear despite the years, settled on the group of teens. 3 boys, maybe college age, one with dyed red hair, another in a hoodie with headphones around his neck, the third snapping a photo of the scene, presumably to post online. He said nothing, just looked at them, not with anger, not with shame, but with something that caught the attention of a girl sitting near the window, a look of patience, of depth, of someone who had been somewhere they hadn't. One of the teens, noticing her interest, leaned over toward the girl. "You know him or something?" She shook her head. "No, but maybe you should shut up. He could be someone." The red-haired boy chuckled. "Yeah, sure. Probably invented the cassette tape." But the barista, a tall man with salt and pepper stubble and tattoos curling around his wrists, narrowed his eyes. "Hey, enough. Oh, come on." "He's not even using a phone," the headphone boy muttered. "How's that enough to get offended these days?" "Because that's Mr. Dalton," the barista said flatly, placing a cappuccino on the counter. "And Mr. Dalton's the reason your fancy little phones even exist." The laughter stopped. Mr. Dalton didn't react. He just turned a page in his book. "Wait, what?" one of them said. The girl by the window looked intrigued. "Who is he?" The barista sighed, drying a glass. "He doesn't talk about it, but he used to work for the Department of Defense. Back when communication meant life or death, that man designed the HawkNet system." "What's HawkNet?" the redhead asked. "Only the most advanced military communication system of its time. Encrypted, undetectable, and stable enough to work during nuclear threats. You've never heard of it because it works so well. It stayed a secret for over 20 years. They turned toward the old man again. He still hadn't moved. The book lay open in his lap, but his gaze had shifted to the cafe window, watching the rain. "I don't buy it," one of the boys said. "If he was so important, why would he be sitting here alone?" The girl stood and walked over to him, cautiously. "Excuse me, sir. Is it true? Did you really build a military communication system?" He blinked, slowly lowering the book. Then he smiled faintly, his voice raspy but warm. "I suppose that depends on how you define build." She pulled out a chair without asking and sat. "Tell me," he chuckled. "Curious, are you?" The barista leaned over the counter. "You should tell them, Mr. Dalton. Maybe it's time." The old man looked down at his hands, fingers lined with age but steady. He let out a long breath. And then, for the first time in years, he spoke of the past. "I was 27 when I first walked into the secure labs at Fort Meade, 1969, Cold War in full swing. I'd been recruited straight out of MIT for a top-secret program. The military wanted something impossible, a way to communicate across continents, underground, in enemy territory, in storms, during bombings, without ever being detected. The tech we had, primitive, but the stakes, astronomical. The teens, still skeptical, pulled chairs closer, but none of them interrupted. They gave me a team. Some of the best minds I've ever met. We worked in shifts around the clock, built prototypes out of junk parts. I soldered wires with my own hands, tested frequencies till my ears rang for weeks. We didn't sleep. Sometimes we didn't eat. "Why?" the red-haired boy asked, now genuinely curious. "Why push that hard?" He looked at the boy. "Because if we didn't, soldiers died. The cafe fell silent. I designed something called Scepter, he continued. Secure command protocol for emergency transmissions and encrypted relay. It could bounce signals off the ionosphere, tunnel under magnetic interference, even piggyback off enemy satellites without detection. We lost 2 test pilots during development. They flew too close to a Soviet base in Kazakhstan. His voice caught just a little. The girl reached out and touched his hand. We deployed Scepter in 1973. And for the next 25 years, it saved thousands of lives. During the Gulf War, it rerouted command lines when the main satellites were knocked out. They said the president himself used it during a blackout to prevent a nuclear misfire. Why haven't we heard about it? The headphone boy whispered. Because if you do your job right in my line of work, Dalton said, no one ever knows you were there. There was a long pause. The girl leaned forward. So why don't you use a phone now? He smiled. Because I've already spent a lifetime talking to people I couldn't see. Through signals no one understood. Now I'd rather look someone in the eye when I speak. The redhead swallowed hard. I'm sorry for what I said. Mr. Dalton nodded gently. It's all right. You didn't know. But next time, don't assume someone's obsolete just because they don't have a gadget in their hand. The door opened and a young man in uniform walked in, a military officer, early 30s, sharp eyes, buzz cut. Mr. Dalton, he said respectfully. Yes, I've been looking for you. The Department of Defense is honoring veterans and inventors who shape modern warfare. They asked me to personally invite you to D.C. Next week. There's going to be a ceremony. Your work is finally being declassified. They're calling it the Silent Architects Program. Dalton blinked. They're declassifying Scepter. Yes, sir. And they want you to speak. The barista grinned. Damn right they do. Dalton looked around the cafe. Everyone was watching now. No laughter, just awe. He stood, slowly but firmly. The officer offered an arm, but he waved it off gently. I can still walk, son. The teen stood up instinctively. Sir, thank you for your service. One of them said. Dalton smiled. Thank you for listening. As he moved toward the door with the officer, the girl called out, Can I come to the ceremony? I want to hear more. He turned. Only if you promise to put your phone away during it. She grinned. Deal. And then he was gone. But the memory lingered. And by the next week, when Mr. Dalton stood at the Pentagon podium, broadcasted across the nation, everyone in that cafe watched, not through TikTok, not through memes, but through silent tears, remembering the man who once sat quietly in the corner, reading a book, and who had once saved the world without saying a word. The morning of the ceremony, the sun rose over Washington, D.C. in a haze of gold and gray. Inside a reserve suite at the Willard Hotel, Henry Dalton stood quietly before a mirror. He wore a dark navy suit, freshly tailored, with a crisp white shirt and an old tie faded burgundy with a barely noticeable pattern. It had once belonged to his best friend in the lab, Samuel Winters, who had died testing one of their earliest prototypes in a remote part of Alaska. Henry had kept the tie all these years. He adjusted his collar and breathed in slowly. Sam, he whispered to the empty room. Looks like we're finally getting some daylight. There was a knock. He opened the door to find the girl from the cafe, Emma, standing there in a navy blue dress with a press badge clipped to her collar. Emma, he asked, surprised. She smiled shyly. I told you I'd be there, but I didn't tell you I'm a journalism student. I pitched your story to my editor after that day. Now, everyone wants to know about the man who whispered through the static. Henry chuckled. That's what they're calling me now, she grinned. I thought it was better than smartphone grandpa. They walked side by side down the corridor, her youthful energy a contrast to his slow, methodical steps. Outside, a sleek black car awaited them, driven by a young military sergeant. Mr. Dalton, the driver greeted, saluting. We're honored to have you, sir. Inside the vehicle, Emma pulled out a small voice recorder. Do you mind if I ask you a few questions before the event? He shrugged. You're not going to let me read my book, are you? Only if I can read it after you. He smiled, then nodded. Ask away. What do you remember most about building Scepter? He paused. The silence. The weight. The knowledge that if we failed, people we'd never meet would die. I remember the faces of my team. We weren't trying to build fame. We were trying to build hope. She leaned in, voice softer. And what was it like when they told you it worked? He looked out the window, eyes glinting. They didn't tell me. I found out when a general handed me a sealed envelope after a mission in Beirut. Inside was a single sentence: you saved 67 today. That's all. No names. Just that. Emma swallowed. What happened to the others on your team? Some retired, some disappeared into black ops. Samuel didn't make it past year 3. Jane, our encryption specialist, died of cancer before we saw it go global. I'm the last one left. There was a long silence. At the Pentagon, a red carpet had been laid across the courtyard, leading to a temporary stage flanked by banners. The words "Silent Architects" were printed in bold white letters. Military brass stood in rows. Faces stern but respectful. Reporters lined the edges, but none of them caught Henry's eye. His gaze went straight to the front row, where he saw a group of young people seated in the audience. The cafe boys, red-haired Mike, headphone-wearing Theo, and the skeptical Nate, cleaned up, dressed, neatly. Eyes locked on him. When he nodded, they stood up and saluted awkwardly, but sincerely. Emma grinned. Looks like your fan club is here. As the master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, the crowd quieted. Ladies and gentlemen, today we recognize a man whose genius remained hidden beneath decades of silence. A man who didn't seek fame, but whose work made it possible for millions of soldiers, agents, and diplomats to speak when the world was at its most dangerous. He turned to Henry. Please welcome Henry Dalton. The applause swelled, not polite, not forced, but real, deep, rising. Henry approached the podium, trembling only slightly. He removed his cap, revealing silver hair combed back. He stared into the lights, the crowd, the sea of cameras, and then he began. I've been silent for most of my life, he said simply, and when I spoke, I preferred wires and signals to podiums and stages. But I'll break that habit today. He paused. I was not a warrior. I was not on the front lines, but I served with warriors, and I built the lines they counted on. He looked at the rows of uniforms. I don't know your names, but I know your voices. I heard them in every simulation, every test, in every night when we tried to reach across continents through noise and chaos. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small metal object, an original Scepter chip. This saved lives, and not because of me alone, but because a dozen minds worked till they bled to make it real. They're not here. But today, I speak for them. The crowd stood in silence. Henry's eyes moistened. Technology isn't about the tools we hold. It's about the people we protect with them. Remember that, always. The moment held, then thunderous applause broke. That evening, Emma's story went live. He whispered through the static. The forgotten genius who shaped the modern world trended within hours. Comment sections flooded with tributes. Veterans shared memories of last-minute orders received through strange frequencies. Retired agents recalled trusting voices on scrambled lines during hostage situations. Former presidents released statements, and the cafe, they renamed a corner table. A small plaque read, Henry Dalton's table, where silence once spoke louder than Wi-Fi. Mike, Theo, and Nate volunteered to run a local tech class for seniors. Inspired by Henry, Emma won an award for her story. And every year after that, on the same day, people across the country would put their phones away for an hour and sit with someone really talk. As for Henry, he returned to his small house just outside of Baltimore. No computers, no smart fridge, just a radio, his books, and a garden. But once a week he'd receive a handwritten letter from someone he'd never met, thanking him, remembering him, and he always replied, Because after a lifetime of unheard signals and unspoken truths, Henry Dalton's voice, once whispered through the static, finally had an audience that listened. The rain outside Henry's house tapped gently against the windows. He sat at his wooden desk, letters open in front of him, some from veterans, others from children whose parents once served in war zones. His wrinkled hands carefully unfolded a handwritten note from a man named James. "I was 7 when my dad came back from the Gulf. He told me a strange device called Scepter helped guide their unit out after the radios died. I never understood what that meant. Now I do. Thank you, Mr. Dalton. You brought my dad home." Henry exhaled softly. The name Scepter still stirred 1,000 memories, some glorious, some heavy. His gaze drifted to an old photo on the shelf. It was black and white. 4 young engineers, standing outside a nondescript concrete building, laughing mid-joke. Henry was on the left, impossibly young, hair thick and swept to the side, sleeves rolled. Next to him, arms around each other, were Samuel Winters, Jane Lockhart, and a giant of a man named Antonio Vega. Each one of them had contributed something vital to Scepter. Each one had paid a cost. Flashback, Fort Meade, 1971. The underground lab buzzed with low hums of oscillators and the sharp tapping of typewriter keys. Fluorescent lights flickered above, giving everything a ghostly pallor. Henry stood at a long metal table cluttered with circuit boards, wires, and papers. Jane Lockhart leaned over, biting her lower lip in concentration, scribbling equations across a chalkboard. Samuel, sleeves stained with solder, adjusted his headset and frowned. "No signal from Relay B," he muttered. Henry didn't look up. Recheck the frequency range. "SCEPTER's uplink is designed for gamma suppression." "I did," Samuel replied, 3 times. "And unless you've reinvented physics while I went for coffee, we've got a phase drift." Jane walked over. "Unless the interference isn't random, we're bouncing off something that's moving fast." Henry stopped, eyes locking on hers. "A satellite." Vega looked up from his workstation. "You saying they've launched a new bird?" Jane nodded. "A Soviet one, probably military grade." The room fell silent. That meant the test wasn't just being jammed, it was being watched. Henry swallowed. "All right, no panic. Shift the relay. Bring up the fallback node." "Henry," Samuel said quietly, "if they know we're testing, they'll try to crack it." Henry stepped back from the table, breathing through his nose. "Then we'll give them noise. Build a ghost signal. Mask the core data with artificial telemetry." Jane grinned. "Now you're talking my language." That night, they didn't sleep. They rewrote entire scripts, burned new chips, soldered with trembling fingers burned from contact with overheating boards. 2 days later, Arctic field test. Inside a snow-covered outpost, manned by Marines. Henry stood shivering in a thick parka, headset crackling with static. "Dalton, you reading?" came Jane's voice. "Reading," he answered. "Uplink stable. Ghost signal deployed. Now or never." Henry closed his eyes and pressed the activation switch. Seconds passed. Then message received. Came the Marine commander's voice from miles away, across buried terrain and cloud-choked skies. Crystal clear. Henry let out a shaky breath. Jane's cheer came through the headset, followed by Samuel's whoop. They'd done it. They'd sent a secure signal across a battlefield where nothing should have worked. Scepter was born that night. Back to present day, Emma's story exploded across the media. Interviews poured in. News anchors called him a genius, a relic of brilliance from a forgotten age. Universities offered to name labs after him. Defense contractors asked for lectures. Henry declined almost all of it. Instead, he asked for one thing: the names of all the soldiers whose lives had been saved through Scepter operations. Not for recognition, just to know. When a folder arrived, thick with classified reports now unsealed, he read each name aloud. In his quiet living room, candle lit beside the radio, he whispered every identity into the space around him. A week later, Emma returned to visit. "You could have been famous, you know," she said, sipping tea in his garden. Henry shrugged. "What would fame have given me that a working system didn't?" She tilted her head. You're not like anyone I've met, he chuckled. That's the nicest way I've ever been called old-fashioned. No, she said. I mean it. You're grounded, like you're still connected to something most of us forgot. He nodded slowly. The past doesn't go away, Emma. It lives in echoes. We just stop listening. Later that night, another flashback. Henry was alone in the lab, 1974. The Cold War tensions had peaked. They just received intel that Moscow had developed a signal-disrupting wave capable of frying scepter relays in live combat zones. General Harrington had stormed in hours earlier. We need a counter now. Dalton, if Scepter fails in deployment, we lose more than just battles, we lose trust. I understand, sir. You have 48 hours. When the general left, Henry stared at the blueprints. Heart pounding, he was exhausted. Everyone was. Jane had fallen asleep at her desk. Samuel was running on caffeine and fury. Henry took a breath and made a decision. A gamble. He would rewire the frequency core, not through the designated chips, but with a risky algorithm that exploited something few knew existed, a resonance pattern buried in the Earth's own magnetic fields. If it failed, it could destroy the hardware. If it worked, it would make Scepter immune. It worked, but it fried every prototype but one, and that night, Samuel collapsed in the hallway from an undetected blood clot in his brain. He never woke up. Back to present, Emma found Henry in the garden the next morning, staring at the sky. Thinking of him, she asked gently. He nodded. He gave everything. For a signal. He wouldn't have regretted it, she said. No, Henry agreed, but I do. I regret not telling him he was the bravest man I knew. Emma stepped beside him. You just did, and I'll make sure the world hears it. The final ceremony, Arlington Cemetery. They gathered beneath the shade of whispering trees. Veterans, families, politicians, young engineers. A marble plaque had been added next to a row of other fallen innovators. It read, Samuel Winters, Architect of Silence. Friend, Hero 1944, 1974. Henry stood beside it, tears in his eyes. I'm sorry I waited so long. Sam, from behind him, someone placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. It was Mike, the red-haired teen from the cafe. We started a project at school, sir, he said, voice earnest. We're building a device that transmits handwritten messages across networks. Old tech with new twists. We named it the Dalton Protocol. Henry smiled, the tears freely falling now. Young man, that means more to me than any medal ever could. And so, an old man who had once been laughed at for not using a phone lived to see a world that not only remembered his name, but also listened when he finally spoke. Because when the world was cold, and the lines were dead, and hope was a fragile signal on the edge of noise, it was Henry Dalton's silence that shouted the loudest. That night, Henry lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the moonlight slipping in through the curtains in soft streaks. His fingers rested on the spine of the same old paperback he always kept by the nightstand, The Art of Listening, by an obscure author long forgotten by history. The irony never escaped him. He'd built machines that allowed generals to bark orders from continents away. And yet his proudest legacy wasn't the clarity of transmission. It was the silence between the signals, the part no one noticed. A knock came at the door the next morning. Henry opened it and found Emma standing there, a laptop tucked under her arm and a wild gleam in her eyes. You're trending, she said breathlessly. Everywhere. Henry blinked. Trending where? On foot. She laughed. No, I mean your story. The article's been translated into 15 languages. Veterans are sharing it. Families of soldiers are commenting. And she flipped open the laptop, turning it to show him the screen. A documentary teaser. Whispers in the Static. The Man Who Built Silence, coming to Netflix. Executive producer Emma Lou Henry stared at it. You made a film. I pitched it after you spoke in D.C., she said. Then I traveled, interviewed families, agents, engineers. They remembered you, or at least what you built. Henry's voice was barely a whisper. I didn't think people remembered silence. She nodded. They do when it saves lives. He sat heavily in his chair. What else does it say? She scrolled. There's a section about Samuel, Jane, Antonio. I tracked down Jane's daughter. She's a robotics professor now. She says your team inspired her. Henry closed his eyes. Jane's encryption code, it still hasn't been broken. She designed it with so many layered paradoxes. It practically thinks for itself. Emma's phone pinged. She glanced at it, then gasped. What is it? You've been nominated for the National Medal of Technology and Innovation. Henry blinked. Emma grinned. You have to accept. But Henry shook his head slowly. I'll go. But I want you to give the speech. Me, she asked, stunned. You brought their voices back. You lit the fire again. Emma swallowed hard. I don't know what to say. Henry reached over and gently tapped her chest. Say what you heard in here. That's what they'll remember. Flashback, 1972. Emergency field briefing. South Korea, a U.S. intelligence officer named Major Lawrence burst into their bunker holding a crumpled dispatch. Souls out, comms dead. Enemy signals everywhere. We can't reach the border units. We're blind. Henry, Jane, and Antonio looked up from their map. Use the satellite relay, Jane said. They're jamming everything. SCEPTR's our last hope. Henry stood. We'll guide you manually. What? I'll broadcast the signal from here. Override our fail-safes. It'll be rough, could burn out the console, but if I shift through atmospheric pockets. Dalton, Jane warned. I know. But if we don't, 1,000 troops walk into a trap. He turned and started adjusting dials, whispering to himself. Antonio's large hand steadied the circuit board. I got your back, hermano. The moment he initiated the pulse, the room went black for half a second, then lit up with green confirmation on the screen. Connected, Jane whispered. 3 hours later, the troops safely diverted. The South Korean units held the line. That day, Scepter wasn't just a prototype, it became legend. Present day, award ceremony. Emma stood before the White House press corps, nerves coiling in her stomach. Henry sat in the front row, flanked by veterans and scientists. She stepped up, adjusted the mic, and began. Not long ago, I met a man who didn't use a smartphone. People mocked him for it, called him outdated. But he was anything but. He was timeless. The room held its breath. Henry Dalton designed silence. And in that silence, he saved lives. He built a way for men and women in battle to reach each other when all else failed. And while we flooded our world with noise, he made the quiet powerful. She paused, voice trembling. He reminded me that the most important messages aren't the loudest. They're the ones that arrive when you need them most. As applause thundered, Henry stood not for himself, but for Samuel, Jane, and Antonio, for the ghosts that still whispered in the static. A year later, the Dalton Initiative became a government-sponsored education program teaching secure communication engineering in high schools across the country. Its motto, speak softly, build clearly. Emma's documentary won an Emmy. Henry declined to attend the ceremony, instead hosting a backyard dinner for the cafe boys, now freshman engineering students. As they grilled burgers, Theo asked, Mr. Dalton, what would you do if you had all today's tech back then? Henry chuckled. Probably ruin it. Laughter. No, seriously, Mike said. What do we do with all this now? Henry looked up at the stars. Use it to listen, not just to talk. Final scene, quiet morning. Henry's porch. Emma arrived with coffee. Morning, morning. She sat beside him in silence for a while. I have one last question, she said eventually. Shoot. If you had to send one last message out into the world, like Scepter's final signal, what would it be? Henry thought a long time. Then he looked at her. Don't underestimate the quiet ones. And as the sun rose, a quiet man sipped his coffee on a porch that overlooked a world he once helped protect, not with noise, but with brilliance that traveled through static, unnoticed and unthanked, until now.